Behind the peace signs and Liverpudlian charm, the quiet Beatle harbored a decades-long resentment that shaped his solo career and personal legacy. The phone rang once, twice, three times. It was December 1970, barely 8 months after the Beatles' public disintegration. George Harrison, finally free to create music without constraint, sat in the producer's chair at Abbey Road Studios. The voice on the other end belonged to Paul McCartney. "I was wondering if you'd fancy playing on my new record," McCartney asked, his tone casual, as if the band's bitter breakup had never happened. George's fingers tightened around the receiver. The same Paul who had dismissed his songs for years. The same Paul who had controlled, corrected, and condescended. The same Paul who now wanted his guitar skills after spending a decade treating him as a musical afterthought. "Not now, not ever," Harrison reportedly replied before hanging up. This wasn't just a momentary flash of anger. This was the eruption of a volcano that had been building pressure for 15 years. A rejection that encapsulated what friends, biographers, and music historians would later identify as George Harrison's most profound and enduring resentment. But why did the spiritually minded, meditation-practicing Harrison harbor such deep animosity toward his former bandmate? What transformed teenage friendship into such lasting bitterness? Let's rewind. Liverpool, 1958. 15-year-old George Harrison boarded a bus where, by chance, he found himself sitting next to Paul McCartney. They were just schoolboys then. McCartney 16, Harrison a year younger. They shared an obsessive love for rock and roll, guitar licks, and American records that were nearly impossible to find in post-war England. Harrison impressed McCartney with his ability to play Raunchy by Bill Justice, note for note. This chance meeting led to an audition with John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen. Despite his youth, Harrison's technical proficiency earned him a spot in the band. "George was the baby of the group, but not when it came to playing guitar," said Pete Best, the Beatles' original drummer. Even then, he had skills beyond his years. But his junior status would haunt him long after the group transformed into the Beatles and conquered the world. Born on February 25, 1943 in Liverpool, Harrison grew up in a working-class family on Upton Green in the Speke suburb. His father drove a bus. His mother worked as a shop assistant. Unlike the troubled Lennon or the ambitious McCartney, Harrison came from a stable, loving home, though one with limited means. Music offered escape from the gray industrial landscape of Liverpool. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Carl Perkins became his idols. He practiced guitar obsessively, developing a technical precision that would eventually make him one of rock's most tasteful players. When Beatlemania exploded in 1963, Harrison was just 20 years old. As the band's popularity soared to unprecedented heights, he found himself in the shadow of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. While they dominated the albums with their compositions, Harrison was typically granted one or two songs per record. In public, the Beatles presented a united front, four mop-topped lads from Liverpool, sharing equally in fame and fortune. The reality within the group proved drastically different. By 1965, Harrison began exploring Indian classical music, introducing the sitar on Norwegian wood. His spiritual journey led him to India in 1966, where he studied under sitar master Ravi Shankar. This personal and artistic evolution would further separate him from McCartney's pop sensibilities. The quiet Beatle public image masked a growing frustration. While Harrison's compositions like Taxman, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Something demonstrated his evolving talent, the Lennon-McCartney duopoly remained firmly in place. As producer George Martin noted years later, "In retrospect, we didn't give George the attention he deserved. His songs were every bit as good as John and Paul's by the end, but the pattern had been set early on." This pattern, this hierarchy, formed the foundation of what would become Harrison's most profound and lasting resentment. So what really happened between these two musical legends? Why did the most peaceful Beatle harbor such deep-seated animosity toward his bandmate? What made this partnership fracture beyond repair? Buckle up. The true story of George Harrison's resentment toward Paul McCartney reveals a side of the Beatles rarely discussed in the sanitized version of their history. Abbey Road Studios, 1966. Harrison stood before his bandmates, ready to record his composition, Only a Northern Song, for the Sgt. Pepper album. As he played through the intricate arrangement he'd been perfecting for weeks, McCartney interrupted repeatedly. "Maybe try it like this, George," McCartney suggested, taking Harrison's guitar and demonstrating an alternate approach. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. This scene repeated itself countless times throughout the Beatles' recording history. McCartney, the self-appointed musical director, would rework Harrison's guitar parts, critique his compositions, or simply talk over him during creative discussions. Paul had a definite idea of how everything should sound, recording engineer Jeff Emmerich noted in his memoir. With John, he was more careful, but with George, he could be quite dismissive. The relationship had always been unequal. From their first meeting, McCartney was the older, more accomplished musician who had brought Harrison into the fold. This dynamic never fully dissipated, even as Harrison developed into a formidable songwriter himself. During the Get Back sessions in January 1969, tensions reached a breaking point. Cameras rolling for what would become the Let It Be documentary captured McCartney instructing Harrison on how to play a wah-nah guitar part. Harrison's response became legendary. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." The passive-aggressive retort masked a deeper wound. After 12 years together, Harrison still felt treated like a sideman rather than an equal partner. 2 weeks later, Harrison temporarily quit the band. Though he returned under negotiated terms, the damage was irreparable. His resentment toward McCartney's controlling behavior had reached critical mass. Apple Studios, January 1969. The Beatles were working on material for what would become their final album. Harrison presented a new composition, only to have it dismissed by McCartney with a casual wave. "Maybe we'll get to it later," McCartney reportedly said, never returning to Harrison's offering. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of systematic marginalization of Harrison's creative output. From their first album to their last, an unspoken quota system existed. Lennon and McCartney would contribute the bulk of the material, while Harrison was allotted a token 1 or 2 songs per album. The mathematics of this arrangement were stark. By the end of the Beatles' recording career, the band had recorded 213 songs. Of these, Harrison was the primary writer on just 22, roughly 10% of their catalog. What made this restriction particularly galling was that Harrison was accumulating a significant backlog of unrecorded material. By 1970, he had enough songs for a triple album, compositions that had been deemed not good enough for the Beatles. All Things Must Pass, Harrison's post-Beatles triple album, served as definitive proof that McCartney and Lennon had been suppressing a major songwriting talent. Classics like My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, and Isn't It a Pity had all been rejected for Beatles albums. As Harrison later reflected, there was an awful lot of restriction in the Beatles. "I was restricted to 1 or 2 songs, maximum, per album." The irony wasn't lost on critics or fans. Harrison's solo debut outsold both Lennon and McCartney's early solo efforts and received more favorable reviews. The Quiet Beatle had been silenced not by lack of talent, but by the machinations of McCartney's quota system. EMI Studios, 1967. Harrison sat alone in the control room as producer George Martin devoted hours to fine-tuning McCartney's Penny Lane. Days earlier, Martin had spent barely 40 minutes on Harrison's Only a Northern Song before suggesting they move on to more important tracks. The disparity in treatment was glaring. When McCartney or Lennon presented new material, Martin would rearrange his schedule, call in orchestras, and experiment tirelessly. Harrison's compositions rarely received such attention. George Martin gave us everything we needed as Beatles, but there was definitely a hierarchy, said engineer Ken Scott years later. Paul's songs got priority, then John's, and if there was time, George's. This unequal treatment extended beyond studio time. Martin would create elaborate arrangements for Lennon-McCartney compositions, bringing in string quartets, brass sections, and classical musicians. Harrison's songs, by contrast, were often recorded with just the core group. The pattern was so consistent that Harrison began looking elsewhere for validation. He invited Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, partly to enhance the track, but also to ensure the others would take it seriously. I felt sometimes that I was just there to play when they needed a guitar solo, Harrison remarked in a 1977 interview. My songs weren't given the same attention as Paul's or John's. The slights accumulated. When Harrison's masterpiece, Something, was selected as a single, only the second Harrison composition to receive this honor, Frank Sinatra famously called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. Yet he mistakenly attributed it to Lennon-McCartney. Even Harrison's greatest achievement was viewed through the lens of the band's dominant partnership. Martin later acknowledged this imbalance. Looking back, I realize we didn't give George's songs the attention they deserved. That's one of my few regrets from that era. Apple Corps headquarters, London, 1969. The Beatles' business empire was crumbling under mismanagement. Following Brian Epstein's death in 1967, the band had created Apple Corps as their business entity, but it was hemorrhaging money. Enter Alan Klein, the hard-charging American businessman who'd managed the Rolling Stones. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr wanted to hire Klein to sort out the financial mess. McCartney, however, preferred the firm of Eastman and Eastman, his new in-laws. It was 3 against 1, Harrison recalled. Paul wouldn't go with Klein, and we wouldn't go with the Eastmans. This deadlock created an unbridgeable chasm. McCartney began viewing himself as the responsible Beatle trying to protect their interests, while the others saw him as controlling and nepotistic. When Klein negotiated a lucrative new deal with Capitol Records, McCartney refused to sign. The other 3 Beatles felt betrayed. McCartney was putting his personal preferences above the group's financial benefit. Paul wanted it all his way or no way, Harrison told Rolling Stone in 1979. He wouldn't sign the Capitol deal because he didn't like Alan Klein. But what did that have to do with the music? The music was good, and the deal was good. The business conflicts extended to their publishing company, Northern Songs. When it was put up for sale, Harrison advocated for the Beatles to purchase it outright, securing their musical legacy. McCartney waffled, and ultimately the catalog was sold to ATV Music, a decision with massive financial implications that Harrison never forgave. We could have owned all our songs, Harrison lamented years later. Instead, we lost control because we couldn't agree. This business betrayal cut particularly deep for Harrison. Beyond the creative frustrations, McCartney's refusal to present a united front in business matters felt like a personal abandonment. London, April 1970. Harrison picked up the morning newspaper to discover that Paul McCartney had officially left the Beatles, not through a conversation with his bandmates of 13 years, but through a self-interview press release coinciding with the launch of his solo album. The timing couldn't have been more calculated. McCartney's solo debut was scheduled for release just days after this announcement. By publicly declaring the Beatles finished, he guaranteed maximum publicity for his new venture. What McCartney didn't mention was that all 4 Beatles had effectively decided to part ways months earlier. They simply hadn't announced it yet, at Starr and Harrison's request, to avoid disrupting several ongoing projects, including Harrison's production work with Apple artist Billy Preston. We asked Paul to hold off the announcement until our other albums and projects were out, Harrison explained in a 1970 BBC interview. He refused. He wanted to be seen as the first Beatle to officially go solo. This calculated move infuriated Harrison. Not only had McCartney broken ranks with his bandmates, but he had also effectively positioned himself as the aggrieved party leaving a sinking ship, rather than acknowledging the group decision they had all reached. Harrison had spent years accumulating songs rejected for Beatles albums. His triple album, All Things Must Pass, was nearly ready for release, a monumental statement of artistic independence that would establish him as a major solo artist. McCartney's announcement and the resulting media circus overshadowed Harrison's preparations and controlled the narrative of the Beatles' dissolution. Paul made sure he was first out of the gate. Producer Phil Spector, who worked with Harrison on All Things Must Pass, noted, George had this massive work ready to go, but suddenly everyone was talking about Paul leaving the band instead of focusing on the music. The timing felt like a final act of self-centered calculation from a bandmate who had always put his interests first. For Harrison, it confirmed everything he had come to resent about McCartney's character. Madison Square Garden, August 1st, 1971. Harrison took the stage for the Concert for Bangladesh. the world's first major charity rock concert. Alongside him stood an extraordinary lineup: Ringo Starr, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, and Ravi Shankar. One former Beatle was conspicuously absent: Paul McCartney. Harrison had personally reached out to all his musical colleagues for this unprecedented humanitarian effort to help refugees from the Bangladesh Liberation War. The cause was urgent. Millions faced starvation and disease. McCartney declined the invitation. His public explanation centered on bad timing and the complexities of the Beatles' ongoing legal battles. The time wasn't right, he told reporters. For Harrison, this rejection cut deep. Beyond their personal and professional differences, here was a humanitarian crisis that transcended petty conflicts. Harrison had put aside his own comfort to organize a massive benefit on short notice. McCartney's absence felt like a moral failure. George put himself out there for something bigger than rock star problems, said Klaus Vormann, who performed at the concert. He expected everyone to rise to the occasion. The contrast was stark. Harrison, often portrayed as the reluctant Beatle, had stepped into the spotlight for a humanitarian cause, while McCartney, the consummate showman, remained off stage. The public noticed. Reviews of the concert frequently mentioned McCartney's absence. The shows raised over $250,000, equivalent to approximately $1.6 million today, for UNICEF, and demonstrated Harrison's ability to unite the rock community for a greater purpose. "I invited him because it was for charity," Harrison said simply when asked about McCartney's absence. The understatement spoke volumes about his disappointment. For years afterward, the Bangladesh concert remained a point of contention. While McCartney continued building his Wings project, Harrison had created a template for celebrity activism that would influence events like Live Aid years later. His former bandmate's absence from this pioneering effort remained a symbolic wound. EMI Studios, September 1968. Harrison struggled to get his bandmates engaged with his new composition, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Despite multiple attempts, the recording sessions were lifeless. McCartney, in particular, seemed disinterested, offering only perfunctory bass lines and piano parts. In desperation, Harrison invited Eric Clapton to join the session. Suddenly, everyone's attitude changed. McCartney became attentive, focused, professional. The track was completed efficiently and became one of the standout songs on the White Album. "It's interesting to see how nicely people behave when you bring a guest in," Harrison observed dryly. This pattern repeated throughout their later years together. Harrison's compositions were treated as second-tier material until external validation confirmed their worth. McCartney, in particular, seemed reluctant to invest his full creative energy in Harrison's songs. During the Abbey Road sessions in 1969, Harrison presented Something, a ballad of extraordinary beauty. Initially, McCartney's contribution was minimal. Only after Frank Sinatra began covering the song, calling it the greatest love song in 50 years, did McCartney acknowledge its quality. "I think the problem was partly that I'd been typecast," Harrison reflected in a 1987 interview. "I was just the quiet guitarist expected to stay in my corner. When I started writing songs as good as theirs, it upset the apple cart." The creative dismissals extended beyond recording sessions. During live performances, Harrison's songs were often given cursory treatments or dropped entirely from set lists. On their final tour in 1966, only 2 Harrison compositions were performed, and even those were frequently truncated. There was always an undercurrent of, "This isn't really important because it's George's song," said Mal Evans, the Beatles' longtime roadie. For Harrison, these creative dismissals represented the most personal betrayal. Music wasn't just his profession, it was his calling, his form of spiritual expression. To have his artistic voice repeatedly diminished by someone he had once viewed as a mentor was a wound that never fully healed. Twickenham Film Studios, January 1969. Cameras rolled as the Beatles rehearsed for what was intended to be a back-to-basics live album and film. The footage captured multiple tense exchanges between Harrison and McCartney. In one infamous scene, McCartney critiques Harrison's guitar playing. "I'm trying to help you, but I always hear myself annoying you." Harrison responds with barely contained frustration. "You're not annoying me anymore." Director Michael Lindsay Hogg kept the cameras running during these uncomfortable moments. The resulting documentary, Let It Be, released in May 1970, preserved these conflicts for posterity. For Harrison, the film represented a public humiliation. Millions would witness McCartney treating him like a subordinate rather than an equal partner. What had been private frustrations were now exposed on cinema screens worldwide. Those were not happy days for me, Harrison later admitted. To have it all documented on film made it worse. The Let It Be film showed Harrison visibly withdrawing from the group. At one point, he temporarily quits the band, though this moment wasn't included in the final cut. When he returned, it was under negotiated conditions, including abandoning the planned live concert. McCartney, by contrast, is depicted as energetic, engaged, and controlling, attempting to rally his increasingly disinterested bandmates. His good intentions came across as patronizing, particularly in his interactions with Harrison. That film was very one-sided, Harrison told an interviewer in 1987. It showed Paul in charge and the rest of us as his backing band. That's not how the Beatles worked in our prime, but it's how it ended up. After the film's release, Harrison refused to watch it for decades. The public preservation of these tensions felt like a final indignity, his creative subjugation immortalized on film. When McCartney later advocated for the film's re-release on DVD, Harrison strongly opposed the idea. It remained unavailable for decades, in large part due to Harrison's resistance to revisiting this painful chapter. Dakota Building, New York, 1980. In one of his final interviews before his death, John Lennon reflected on his Beatles years. George and I were mates. We understood the audio game. Paul was always the one pushing in a different direction. This observation highlighted another dimension of Harrison's resentment toward McCartney, the special creative and personal bond he had formed with Lennon, which frequently left McCartney on the outside. From their earliest days, Harrison and Lennon shared a similar working-class background, acerbic wit, and eventually spiritual curiosity. They bonded over their mutual love of satirical radio programs like The Goon Show and their skepticism toward fame and fortune. John and I had an understanding, Harrison explained in a 1990 interview. We didn't need to explain ourselves to each other. Paul always needed everything explained. This alliance became particularly evident during the band's later years. When Harrison became interested in Eastern philosophy and meditation, Lennon followed with genuine interest. McCartney's engagement with these spiritual explorations was more superficial. During business conflicts, Harrison and Lennon typically voted as a bloc. They both wanted Alan Klein as manager. They both became disenchanted with McCartney's leadership. They both explored more experimental musical terrain. Paul would come in with these complete songs and expect us to be his backing band, Lennon said in his famous 1970 Rolling Stone interview. George felt the same way I did, that this wasn't what the Beatles were supposed to be. For Harrison, Lennon's friendship offered validation that his frustrations with McCartney weren't simply personal grievances, but legitimate creative differences. When Lennon publicly acknowledged these tensions, it confirmed what Harrison had felt for years. After the Beatles' breakup, Harrison and Lennon collaborated occasionally. They performed together at the Concert for Bangladesh and recorded during Lennon's Lost Weekend period. Their relationship remained warm, if sometimes distant due to geographic separation. McCartney, meanwhile, often portrayed himself as the Beatle who had tried to hold everything together, a narrative that Harrison found revisionist and self-serving. The McCartney as preserver versus Lennon and Harrison as destroyers narrative particularly rankled. John saw through Paul in ways I couldn't articulate, Harrison said in a rare unguarded moment during a 1987 interview. Having John's perspective helped me understand I wasn't crazy for feeling the way I did. London, 1990s. As the Beatles' anthology project gathered momentum, Harrison found himself increasingly frustrated by McCartney's approach to their shared history. In interviews, McCartney often presented a version of events that maximized his contributions while minimizing conflicts. Paul has a certain perspective, Harrison told a reporter with diplomatic restraint. It's not always the way the rest of us remember things. This battle over the Beatles' legacy became Harrison's final source of resentment toward his former bandmate. As the decades passed, McCartney's media presence far outpaced Harrison's. Through sheer volume of interviews, documentaries, and public appearances, McCartney's version of Beatles history gained cultural dominance. The pattern was consistent. McCartney would acknowledge minor conflicts but emphasize the band's camaraderie and creative partnership. Harrison, who gave fewer interviews and avoided revisiting Beatles topics when possible, found his perspective increasingly marginalized. The Beatles anthology was difficult for George, said Klaus Vormann, friend to all four Beatles. He felt pressured to participate in something that would mostly serve Paul's version of events. Harrison's reluctance to embrace constant Beatles nostalgia was often misinterpreted as bitterness. In reality, he had simply moved on, spiritually and artistically. His involvement with Eastern spirituality, slide guitar mastery, and humanitarian efforts defined his post-Beatles identity. McCartney, meanwhile, regularly incorporated Beatles classics into his concert set lists, produced Beatles-themed projects, and kept their collective legacy central to his public identity. This approach wasn't wrong, but it did mean that McCartney's perspective on their shared history received disproportionate attention. The Beatles were four people who got very famous, Harrison said in one of his final interviews. That's all. It wasn't meant to be a lifelong identity. For Harrison, McCartney's eager embrace of Beatles nostalgia felt like one final act of control, defining how their complicated relationship would be remembered by history. But the full story wasn't quite so simple. Despite these deep-seated resentments, Harrison and McCartney's relationship contained moments of genuine affection and creative respect. During the recording of Abbey Road, their final album as a group, Harrison and McCartney collaborated closely on the stunning medley that closes the record. Engineer Jeff Emmerich noted that during these sessions, they seemed to rediscover why they had become friends in the first place. After the Beatles' breakup, there were brief reconciliations. They performed together at Eric Clapton's wedding in 1979. When Harrison founded Handmade Films and saved Monty Python's Life of Brian from cancellation, McCartney was among the first to publicly applaud the move. Harrison's masterpiece, Something, became a McCartney concert staple after Harrison's death in 2001. McCartney would perform it on ukulele, Harrison's favorite informal instrument, as a tribute to his fallen bandmate. "Whatever disagreements we had, I loved him very much," McCartney said at Harrison's memorial concert. Perhaps most tellingly, when Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, McCartney visited him in the hospital. And in 2001, as Harrison fought his final battle with cancer, McCartney sat at his bedside in Switzerland, playing guitar and reminiscing about their Liverpool days. These contradictions, deep resentment alongside moments of reconciliation, reflect the complexity of a relationship that spanned nearly 5 decades. So why did George Harrison keep his true feelings about Paul McCartney largely private during his lifetime? Why not air these grievances more publicly? The answer lies in Harrison's spiritual journey and his complex relationship with his Beatles identity. After immersing himself in Eastern philosophy, particularly the Hindu traditions of Vedanta, Harrison came to view ego attachments, including both fame and resentment, as obstacles to spiritual growth. Public conflicts would have contradicted the inner peace he sought to cultivate. "The Beatles was something that happened to me," he explained in a 1987 interview. "It wasn't my whole life, just a chapter. I needed to move beyond it, not keep reliving old conflicts." There were practical considerations as well. The Beatles brand remained extraordinarily valuable. Public feuding would have threatened not only their musical legacy, but also their ongoing business interests. Apple Corp, their joint company, continued generating millions in revenue that benefited all four former members. Harrison also recognized the importance of the Beatles to their fans worldwide. To publicly dismantle the myth of harmony would have felt like betraying those who found meaning and joy in their music. "People want to believe we were four mates who had a wonderful time together," Harrison observed. "And often we did. The rest isn't anyone's business, really." Perhaps most significantly, Harrison understood that articulating his deepest resentments would only have reinforced his identity as the former Beatle with a grudge. This was precisely the pigeonhole he spent decades trying to escape. Instead, he channeled his frustrations into his solo work. Songs like Wah Wah, Run of the Mill, and Sue Me, Sue You Blues expressed his feelings about McCartney and the Beatles' dissolution with enough creative distance to maintain dignity. By keeping his most profound resentments private, Harrison protected both his spiritual progress and his artistic independence. It was a conscious choice, not a passive failure to address conflicts, but an active decision to transcend them. Let's return to that phone call in December 1970, the one where Harrison reportedly told McCartney, "Not now, not ever," when asked to play on McCartney's solo record. That moment crystallized 15 years of accumulated frustrations. The creative dismissals, the controlling behavior, the business conflicts, the legacy management, all compressed into a single, definitive rejection. Yet Harrison's feelings toward McCartney remained profoundly ambivalent until the end of his life. When asked directly about McCartney in his final interviews, Harrison typically offered diplomatic responses, acknowledging both McCartney's musical brilliance and their difficult personal dynamic. "Paul is a great musician," he said in 1997. "We just saw things differently." Who did George Harrison truly resent most? The evidence points consistently toward Paul McCartney, not as a person perhaps, but as a symbol of creative constraint and hierarchical thinking that Harrison spent his post-Beatles life trying to transcend. The quiet Beatle kept his deepest grudges largely private, but in his music, his business decisions, and his occasional unguarded comments, the truth emerges. George Harrison's greatest resentment was reserved for the bandmate who treated him as a sideman when he had the soul of a frontman. That phone still rings across time, and Harrison's response still echoes, not with hatred, but with the quiet dignity of a man who finally found the freedom to say no.